left off last time, but before we do, a few of you came to me after class and asked about alternative forms of exercise. So the study that I gave, also what you read, the article by Callahan and others, is mostly about aerobic exercise. And as I mentioned earlier, this is about moderate intensity workout, which would mean, if you want to work with pulse, about 70%, between 65 and 75% of your maximum heart rate. Again, you just Google heart rate exercise and you'll immediately get all the tables that you need. But that's one form of exercise. Some of you ask, what about weight training? What about interval training? So sprints and stops, something that the crew team does often, athletes do often. What about this form? The reason why I didn't bring it up explicitly in the lecture is because the jury is still out on the different forms of exercise. But let me tell you what are some of the trends that we see in research. Right now, it seems that if there is only one form of exercise that you do, the best bang for the buck, best value for your time would be aerobic exercise. 3, ideally 4 times 30 minutes of aerobic exercise a week. That's at minimum. However, if you can also do weight training and supplement the aerobic exercise, that's terrific, that's great. Twice a week, 3 times a week of weight training is great, especially as you get older. That weight training contributes more. But also at a very young age, weight training is good. However, it is not a replacement for aerobic exercise. It hasn't shown to have the same psychological effects as aerobic exercise does. The other form of exercise that has been studied, and again, these are all tentative results. There have been pilot studies about it. The ends, the sample sizes are not large enough yet to say definitively, just like we can say about aerobic exercise, it has a similar effect to some of our most powerful psychiatric drugs. That's definitive. There are tons of studies on it ever since Babiak 2000 as well as before. But another form of exercise that has begun to be studied with some very promising results is interval training. Interval training would be, say, running at between 90 and 95% of your maximum heart rate. So if you're 20 and your maximum heart rate would be 200, because it's 220 minus your age, then it would be running at around 180 to 190 pulse rate, which is hard, which is tough, which you can't do for a very long time. But doing it for as little as 30 seconds up to a minute, and then resting, letting your heart rate go back down to 60% of its maximum, say 120, and then doing another interval, that has been shown with pilot studies only to have remarkable effects. In fact, often more powerful than aerobic exercise on its own, and lasts for even longer, the effect. So, again, I did not introduce it officially as part of the class, but since many of you asked, I'm introducing it because what I want to introduce here are only things that are with very robust results. John Ratey talks about this, and I'll talk a little bit about John Ratey in a minute. He's the Harvard Medical School psychiatrist who's probably the leading proponent and researcher in the area of exercise and mental health. And he himself, even though the results are still tentative, he introduces 2 interval trainings a week. So in addition to working out 6 days a week, 2 of them include full-out sprinting, rest. Full-out sprinting, rest. And what they've shown is that with even less time than 30 minutes, you can get the same psychological effect and even better. What I do twice a week, I introduce interval training. So for example, this morning when I was on my trampoline, I did it for 30 minutes, and out of the 30 minutes, there were 4 sprints. Indeed. You don't believe me that I do trampoline, do you? I'll videotape it. Maybe not. So 4 sessions of sprints, and then I have my heart monitor on, going all the way, for me, it's about 165 heart rate, between 165 and 170. And then resting, going back to about 110, which is more or less 60% of my maximum, and then doing it 4 times. And for the rest of the 30 minutes, I just do moderate aerobic exercise. So I also introduce the interval training. The weight training I do less of because I get that from yoga, a lot of the strengthening exercises. The most important thing, though, that I do want to say about interval training is that, especially for perfectionists, it's very easy to overtrain. You don't want to get to your maximum heart rate and keep it there for a long time, even if you can. More does not necessarily mean better. Again, unless you're training for the Olympics, in which case you do want to get to 100% of your maximum heart rate at times. For maximum health, you want to get to 90%, maximum 95% of your max heart rate, which is why a heart rate monitor can help so much, because it can tell you when you're working too hard or when it's too easy. Bottom line, variety is good for exercise. If you can introduce dancing, that's great exercise. If you can introduce once in a while working out in the gym, once in a while playing basketball, rowing, the more variety, the better. But the foundation, at least 3, ideally 4 times a week, 30 minutes of aerobic exercise. So we stopped last time with overcoming barriers. And some of the barriers are that it's difficult, there is some pain associated with it, even if you are at 70% of your heart rate. It's still uncomfortable. And ways to deal with it is, at least until you get into it, because very often we enter the zone when we start to run and we don't feel the difficulty anymore. But at least at the beginning, it's important to have social support, to divide and conquer, to build gradually, and to have distractors such as TV, your MP3 or whatever it is. Another barrier, and this one is unfortunately very common here on campus, is that we just don't have time. In high school, I give a lot of talks in high schools, and one of the things that I see there is that students generally, in many high schools, actually have to be part of a team. They have to, in addition to doing physical exercise, PE, they also have to be part of a team. So they get not enough, but more exercise. Whereas one of the first things that go in college, especially or only for students who do not play on the team, one of the first things that go is exercise. I don't have time. I have so many things I want to do. It's a new world. Well, it's also the first thing that goes during exam period because I'm so stressed and I have so many things to do. Well, it should be the last thing to go. It should be the last thing to go. Why? Because it is an investment. You may be losing the 45 minutes, working out for 30 minutes and showering after, which I recommend. You may lose that 45 minutes, but you'll gain so much more. It's such a good investment. Why? Because your memory actually gets better when you exercise. So you get more bang for the buck in terms of time you study. Your creativity levels go up. Your concentration, whether you have ADD or not, especially if you have a tendency toward ADD or ADHD. But even for people without it, concentration goes up significantly. Energy levels go up significantly. So it's a very good investment. Remember I told you the story when I stopped exercising at the end of the squash season. And suddenly I said, I have so much time. And I ended up getting so much less done. A, because I didn't have the rituals. And B, because I wasn't as focused, I wasn't as creative, I wasn't as energized. It should be the last thing to go, especially during stressful periods, such as exam period. One way to overcome the time commitment, again, is not to rely on self-discipline. We've established that before we saw the research, we have a limited amount of self-discipline. Create rituals where, say, 3 mornings during the week you'll do it, or if a good time for you is the afternoon or evening, but have a ritual around it. Another barrier to exercising regularly, and this is an interesting one and often overlooked but extremely powerful, and that is the subconscious barrier. Nathaniel Branden talks about this, and I talk about it a little bit in my book, quoting him. He talks about self-esteem, and part of self-esteem is the notion that we are worthy of happiness. The notion of being worthy of happiness. And when you ask people, are you worthy of happiness? Most people will say yes. But if you ask the subconscious, very often for many people, it's no. Whether it's because of the voices that we heard in the past, from teachers, educators, parents, significant adults, society at large, by comparing us to unrealistic models. But very often we have this voice, the subconscious level, that we're not really worthy of happiness. And that is a barrier that stops us from becoming happier. Now, one of the things that we know with exercise is that it's one of the, if not the most powerful drug for making us happier. Now, I know that exercise makes me happier, it makes me feel good, but if my subconscious thinks that I'm unworthy of these feelings, unworthy of being happy, it may, in fact, stop me from exercising. Why? Because remember, the mind doesn't like when there is an inconsistency between what's inside and what's outside. And if what's inside is saying, shouldn't be happy, then I try to match it with what's inside. And then I don't exercise. Because if I do exercise, then there will be a disconnect. I will be happier than I think I'm worthy of. There's a lot of research on this. For example, by a psychologist by the name of Swan, who talks about self-confirmation theory, which is a very powerful force within us. There is a self-enhancement that we want to appear good in other people's eyes, in our eyes, but there is a counter force, which is self-confirmation, where we want to confirm whatever we think about ourselves. And if we think not worthy of happiness, we'll very often not do things that actually will make us happy. We see it in other areas, in relationships, for example. If I think I'm unworthy of a wonderful partner, of being happy in a relationship, very often I will inadvertently, subconscious working here, jeopardize the relationship and look for things that are not working. Actively, subconsciously, look for ways of hurting the relationship. So we need to be aware of the subconscious level, and it very much applies to whether or not we exercise.